Good evening. Welcome to the Ismaili Center, Toronto. And before I begin, acknowledge the traditional lands of the Mississauga New Credit, which we're on. Commissioner Mary Wilson, author and poet Lee Maracle, our moderator for this evening, Rachel Giza, President of the In-Spirit Foundation, institutional leaders, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and Yali Madad. It is great to see such a large turnout to this evening's presentation, especially given the competition of a pre-election debate by our three future leaders. Of course, there is an event happening at the museum today, and of course, the hot Jays who continue to amaze us. And so we'll now turn to some serious matters. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a unique endeavor that has been implemented in a number of countries to understand, acknowledge, and bring reconciliation where significant wrongs were experienced by the peoples of those countries. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada was established in 2009 by the survivors of the residential schools as a result of a court case against the government. And its task has been daunting, to say the least. First, to record the experiences of children and anyone else who was impacted by the residential schools. Number two, to tell Canadians the truth about those experiences and the lasting impacts they've had. And number three, finally, to guide a process of reconciliation between and within Aboriginal families, communities, churches, governments, and Canadians. We as Canadians in this are fortunate and blessed to be in this great country, and to whom and that means that we need to have a deeper appreciation of the history of Canada, not only of the past 30 or 40 years, but much longer, so that we understand the plurality, the achievements, and the challenges of this great land that is so envied around the world. As His Highness the Aga Khan stated in the opening ceremonies of the Ismaili Center at Toronto almost a year ago to the date, Canada, of course, has become a significant newer homeland of our community, as Ismailis have come here from so many places, from East Africa, from Tajikistan, from Afghanistan, from Syria, and from other parts of the world, all choosing to develop their destinies under the Canadian flag. What we dedicate today is what we identify as an Ismaili Center, a building that is focused around our Jamaat Khana, but which also includes many secular spaces. These are places where Ismailis and non-Ismailis, Muslims and non-Muslims will gather for shared activities, seminars, lectures, recitals, receptions, exhibitions, and social events. These meeting halls and lounges, work offices and conference rooms will serve the organizational needs of the Ismaili community, but they will also, we trust, be filled with the sounds of enrichment, dialogue, and warm human rapport, as Ismailis and non-Ismailis share their lives in a healthy, gregarious spirit. On behalf of the Ismaili community and the Aga Khan Conciliation and Arbitration Board in Canada, I would like now to introduce the president of In Spirit Foundation, Andrea Nemtin. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome. Thank you, Karim. It's such an honor to be here. It's really quite a wonderful place to be. The In Spirit Foundation has been very much informed and inspired by the work of His Highness, the Aga Khan. His work globally is impacted. I think actually the Global Development Network is the largest foundation in the world. And his approach to creating inclusive societies where pluralism can thrive is quite remarkable, and it has been tried and tested for 60 years, if not more. So thank you for having us. It's an honor to be here. I'm here to welcome you to the Change Up Dialogue, the first of 2 evening lectures that are public events that are part of our 4-day conference. It's our first conference where we're bringing all of our grantees together to share their learning, their experiences. And we're really so grateful to be hosted here for the next 4 days. The In Spirit Foundation is a charitable foundation. We work towards building more inclusive and pluralist Canada. We work with young people, 18 to 34, and we work in the area of media, the arts. We work in impact investing. And we are really looking to try and not just aspire to an inclusive and pluralist Canada, but to actually encourage people to start addressing some of the challenges, some of the barriers. Reconciliation has been core to our work. Remaking the relationships and improving the relationships between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada is really so essential for us to have a country where we can all thrive, where we can all have access to the political, social, and economic elements of our society. So we've been very inspired by the TRC. The recent report with the TRC, and I'd like to say that is a pinpoint, but really the work of activists, artists, and poets who have been working to rebuild these relationships for many years. So the collaboration of all of the voices has created a moment, an opportunity for us as individuals and as communities to really make a difference. And it's so amazing to see you all here, to have come here on a Thursday night when there's so much else going on, to be together, to be thinking about this subject. Your presence and your time, it makes a difference. I'm going to just take a moment and also thank our speakers with a gift of gratitude. It's a gift of tobacco that I'd like to give to our Dr. Marie Wilson and Lee Maracle for coming here today to share their knowledge and their stories. So join me in a thank you. And without further ado, I get to introduce our moderator tonight, Rachel Giza. She's a journalist, an editor, a broadcaster, multi-award winning author. You've heard her on the CBC, guesting on Radio Q on the Sunday edition. You've read her in the Toronto Star, The Grid, The Walrus, and now tonight you get to be with her. So let me please welcome to the stage, Rachel.
Do you want me at the podium or should I go? Thank you very much. I want to bring, I'll introduce them, but I want to bring them to the stage first. So if Lee and Marie could come to the stage, and I'll introduce them. Marie Wilson has dedicated her career to living and working in cross-cultural environments within Canada and internationally as an educator, award-winning journalist, broadcast trainer, program director, and regional executive in both the public broadcast and public service sectors. She also has deep personal knowledge of the residential school legacy through her immediate family and community ties. Between 2009 and 2015, she served as one of 3 of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commissioners. Please welcome Marie Wilson. And next to me, I'm delighted to introduce Lee Maracle. She is a Stola Nation grandmother of 7, a mother of 4 who was born in North Vancouver, BC. Her works include the novels Raven Song, Bobby Lee and Sundogs, short story collection Sojourner's Truth, a poetry collection, and Bent Box, and the nonfiction piece I Am Woman. Ms. Maracle is both an award-winning author and teacher. She is currently the mentor for Aboriginal students at the University of Toronto, where she is also a teacher, and she is an instructor for the Indigenous Theatre School, where she is a part-time cultural instructor. She is the recipient of the Premier's Award for Excellence in the Arts. Please help me in welcoming Lee Maracle. You got a whoop. You got a. Lee was telling me earlier that her grandson asked her a little while ago if she was here. He was Googling her, and he found out that she was famous by Googling her. So. Before we get to our conversation, first of all, I wanted to say how honored I am to be moderating and talking to these inspiring women tonight. And I feel like I'd love to see them up on stage with the leaders tonight in the debate. That would be a show. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A from the audience. And we'd love to hear from all of you, but in particular, it would be great, and I know both Lee and Marie would love to hear from the delegates that are here. So please raise your hand. There'll be somebody going around with a mic. I'll call on you, and then someone with a mic will come your way. And then Lynn, who, I don't know where Lynn is, but, there at the back, she's waving her hand. She's going to be tweeting the event, and if you're feeling shy, you can also tweet a question at Lynn, and Lynn can ask the question. Does that sound good? Okay, perfect. I wanted to start with you, Lee. The focus of our discussion tonight, our starting point, is the Truth and Reconciliation, the report and the recommendations. And you wrote something, it was a really moving piece for the Canadian Encyclopedia about the day that Justice Sinclair announced the report, announced the findings of the report. Could you talk a bit about that day and summarize what you wrote about?
What I wrote was that I knew what happened to my family. And I also wrote about, watching my friends, including Mary, Justice Sinclair, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, Joseph Boyden, many of the honorary witnesses, and those that went for the occasion, many of whom I knew. And they were stoic and brave, and I was not, which is why I didn't go. I sat at home and sobbed. For our lost lives. My sister died as a result of residential school. Several of my cousins died as a result of residential school. Several of my great aunts died as a result of residential school. In fact, I'm the first generation in my family where no children died, and I'm not that old. I was with my father when the apology was on television. And at the end, and these are the most serious words he ever said to me, my father is something of a trickster and a transformer. He's all about humor. Everything is funny, even colonialism and racism is ridiculous and funny. So I was surprised when he said, "At least I know it's not my fault." And I was also horrified, because what was not your fault? And he started to tell me, and my aunt was sitting there. And she said, "Bobby, how could you remember? I don't remember anything." And he says, "I couldn't forget." And then he said, do you remember when I used to go chop wood? I said, yeah. And I said, we used to play that game too. The demons are coming, let's go chop wood. And we'd run outside and chop wood. And then it struck me what that meant. His children made a game of him trying to scare away the demons, which is how he got to be kind to us. I never heard him raise his voice except to sing. And he had a beautiful voice. I remember he tried to teach me to sing. And he said, what's wrong with you? Every second Indian could sing. And I said, I must be the first. But Shane Point has asked me to sing, and I don't know if you know my grandpa's song, Shane. But could you come join me for that? I want to sing. For my grandpa Dan, who when he arrived back from residential school couldn't find his longhouse because they had torn it down. And he was going back and forth, and finally his mother sees him. That was okay. Whoa.
There we go.
Whoa. Thank you. My grandfather saved our songs by becoming an entertainer. That's the only time we were allowed to sing. And my father used to say, how ridiculous is that?
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Marie, you listen to so many stories of trauma and survival. And I'm wondering now that you've had, I know that the commission has been extended for a few more months, but now that you've had time from the report, can you reflect a bit about what this experience has been like for you to be on the commission and to be part of this process?
Well, let me begin by acknowledging where we are. And yes, we're on traditional territories of ancient Indigenous nations, neighbors and friends in this part of now Canada. But we are also in a space.
She can't hear. She can't hear.
Sorry. The sound, I think, is it needs a bit of tweaking. Is it not loud enough? Okay. Oh, the sound. I think that maybe Marie's mic is off.
And mine's screaming in my ear, just so you know.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us know. Okay. Is that better? Oh, no, I think I know. Do we have headphones we could grab quickly? Is that possible to step in? Sorry about that, everybody. We'll get this sorted.
Yeah, you hear that? You hear that? I've been hearing it all this time. I thought I was crazy. The demons are here. My dad is here.
Okay, so
Okay.
I think, are we, Bashir, is it okay now? I can't hear myself loudly, so.
Check.
Okay,
Check,
we'll bring
check.
a mic to you. Can you bring a mic, Jane, just in case? I think I'm okay, so why don't we just give one to...
Take the headset off, all right? So like
Do you want me to take mine off too?
Hello? Oh, there we go. There I have, yeah, that's working now. Yeah.
Lee, you are going to get to use a wireless mic, which is way more fun, let's face it. Way more Vegas.
Thank you.
Okay, got it.
Jane Farrow to the rescue. I'm good. Sorry, Marie. So if you could...
Well, you were asking me about the experience of listening to all those stories and doing the work of the commission. And what I was about to say is that I have such a strong sense here in your beautiful space that this is sacred space. This is space that has been created with spirit in mind. And for the past 6 years, we have gathered in spaces, many of them so much more humble than this space, but that were equally sacred in the spirit that gathered there. And so I feel as though I've been on a 6-year journey of traveling our country in sacred space, where people were allowed really to speak from the depths of their spirits, and others gathered to bear witness to that in a supportive and caring way, in a way that was unprecedented and has been unprecedented for our country and unprecedented in the world, in fact, with our commission being unique in so many ways. And so I was overwhelmed with that feeling when I came in here today, and thinking how it's so very different, but how in some ways it's the same, and that the journey of the past 6 years doesn't have to end, because we can continue to gather in places like this, in combinations like this, in community like this, to continue the work and the conversation. So it's been a very difficult journey. It's been a devastating set of truths that we've borne witness to, but at the same time, it has been so uplifting to see the strength and the resilience of people who have found courage to come forward and serve as the teachers that Canada needs so desperately.
Yes, you can hear me? Great. I want to break down the name of the commission, Truth and Reconciliation, and this is for both of you. Do you feel at this point, I mean, I was so struck, Lee, when you were talking about your father's response and saying, now I know I'm not to blame. And Marie, when you and I were talking sort of before this, a few days ago, you talked about going to communities where people knew something terrible had happened but didn't know what it was, didn't know what had happened, didn't know what had caused the trauma and struggle. Do you feel that we are at a place where we have reached an understanding of the truth and of sharing that truth, and what work needs to happen on that side?
Well, half the truth for sure is missing. The criminals didn't have to talk. When two people reconcile, both have to speak. Those responsible for the damage have to address that and then say what they're prepared to do to make restitution. That isn't what happened. We had 7,000 Aboriginal people disclose what happened to them. And they did not see their guilty parties. They did not have to get up and, not me, face themselves like they did in South Africa to avoid jail. Canada promised no charges before they heard the crimes. Sorry, but that's not truth. To me, I'm like my father. My father, by the way, liked listening to the apology. He did not want to speak to that commission.
And I agree with him, it was voyeurism. It's Canada looking at us again. And some of the sickness that has come out in this country is that, well, if I'd known that all those horrible things were happening, possibly I would have been more sympathetic. This country, some of its prominent citizens, can't have empathy for us unless we're bleeding on the floor from all the orifices we could possibly have after everyone has taken a turn raping us. What kind of sickness is that? I think there needs to be another recommendation. Those sick people should come forward for healing. They should come like Sheldon Kennedy did to our community for healing.
I'll answer slightly differently, and I think it might be helpful to all of us. And I've learned this over the years of the Commission, that we make a mistake to assume that everyone in the room necessarily knows all the background to the Commission. And so maybe I should just say a couple of words about how it came to be, and particularly how it was different and completely unique, very different from the South African Truth Commission, both in how it came to be and what its mandate was. Because, you know, we think of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions as something a government puts in place, typically post-conflict, and to try to create or buy or engineer civil peace, often as an alternative to feared civil war. And so it becomes an opportunity for placating, and I'm not saying that cynically, but for calming down and for creating some possibility of dialogue. And there now have been something in the area of 65 or so truth and/or truth and memory or truth and reconciliation projects around the world. The case in Canada was very different in many, many ways. And one of the most important things is that it came about, and this was mentioned in the introduction, and thank you very much for that. It came about not because the government decided to do something, but rather because the victims of harm decided to do something. And who were the victims of harm? 150,000 estimated children who went to forced residential schooling for Aboriginal children over the course of more than 130 years. So 7 generations of forced residential schooling, parallel to a number of ever stricter laws which prevented parents from protesting, which prevented citizens from gathering to protest, which prevented hiring of lawyers to bring suits and so on, and fundamentally also included removal of the right to vote of Aboriginal people in Canada. So it happened in a context over a very long period of time, much longer than I hate to say this, normal military conflict, but over more than a century of time and over multiple generations. And the harms were harms specifically to children, and specifically to children of a particular ethnicity. And that ethnicity was the people who supposedly are one of the 3 founding peoples of Canada: the English and the French and the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So part of the work that we have done in hearing people's stories is to really contemplate the very foundations of Canada. Have we built a country on a cracked foundation? I can't imagine how much work went into designing the foundation of this beautiful space. But have we given enough thought? Did we have the right people in the rooms when we look at that historic photograph of the fathers, note fathers of Confederation? Who was not in the picture, and who was not in the room, and who was not part of the negotiating, who was not part of the constituting, and who had no say in the creation of the schools that would become the norm for so many children? So the commission was hard fought, and it was hard won. It was a term and condition of a massive class action court case, the largest in Canadian history, and it was just one of the terms and conditions. But it's important to know that it was post-judicial. It was not a place to come forward and decide on the criminality or legality of things. It was all after the court process. And so we were not given a mandate to do things like granting amnesty, as happened in South Africa. We also were not given the right to, or the power to determine compensation or recompense. There were provisions for that in the settlement agreement, but not through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Our purpose was primarily and fundamentally educational, to gather and record as best we could from the written records and by creating an oral record all that had happened, to use that to safeguard it for future generations, but also to use that as a way to educate the wider Canadian public, and then to try to inspire reconciliation, whatever that means in whatever ways it could happen. So we didn't have a way to call forward perpetrators, for example. So to come back to these important points that Lee has made. But it would also be wrong to say that no perpetrators declared themselves. Not many, but some did. And some did come forward. It would also be wrong to think that the only people who spoke to the Commission were survivors. Majority were, but not all, and many intergenerational survivors also came forward, but also, and especially in the last couple of years, a growing number of non-Indigenous Canadians who wanted also to go on the record with what they thought about all of this. And so we had elected leaders come forward and give statements, not as political speeches, but as statements to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we also had, and this is very important to note because it was one of the big revelations, when we think about the rack and ruin in many communities across the country, one of the things that became known that was not understood by anybody before was the extent of student-on-student abuse that had happened in the schools. There was terrible abuse by adults, there's no question of that, and some of the most horrific things. And certainly in terms of volume, I'm sure the most. But there was also, far more than anyone realized, student-on-student abuse. And as you went down the generations, the more that became normalized as behavior within the schools, that also happened. And so then you have a situation where some of those perpetrators, who were student perpetrators, also came forward and spoke with incredible courage about what had happened to them prior, what they had done, and what had been a consequence. So it's a complex commission. There is no rubber stamp to what a commission looks like or how it is, and there's no question that there are things that our commission was not, and therefore in some ways what would have been a disappointment or a failure. But what I think it was extraordinary. There has never been such a wide canvas of individual citizens speaking at length about any subject in the history of our country, as far as I know. And I keep saying that, wondering if someone's going to correct me and say, no, there was this or that. But I can't think of anything in our history where so many people spoke in, as opposed to a survey, for example, or what do you think of this or that, and spoke at length from their own expertise. So anyway, that's a lot of content to your question, but
no, but I thank you for that, because again, one of the things we were talking about is wanting to make sure that we didn't want to assume knowledge, and I thank you for giving the background. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Jane. So we've talked about truth, and I want to talk about reconciliation. One of the things that the Commission did do was put forward 94 recommendations, and to give some teeth and muscle to create justice and change. So I wanted to ask each of you, first of all, just to reflect generally on what reconciliation means to you, what that would look like for you.
I think tomorrow, if the government decided they would implement all 94 recommendations over the next decade, that would be a good start. All I want to hear from Canadians in the next decade is all 94 recommendations. And you could email your MPs, you can email your Prime Minister, your ministers, your premiers, even your cities. All 94 might be a good start. I don't want you to pick one that's comfortable
all 94. So that's one. But the other thing that I would like to see is a recognition that reconciliation has been going on for a long time. Just as challenging the residential school system has been going on a long time. I know because I shut one down in BC when I was 19 years old. And I'm a great-grandma now. And I'm not the only one. Some Catholic priests shut their schools down and were excommunicated for it before my time. Others were put in jail. Some of my ancestors were put in jail for objecting. Up in Kenora, they were put in jail for objecting. We've been struggling for reconciliation for a long time. And we have been working to build bridges with you for a long time. I was sent to public school in 1956 with reconciliation with these people in mind. All I ever heard growing up is we must find a way to live with them, even if they don't stop hating us. We must find a way. And my grandfather made his life like that. He's published right next to me in Cascadia, a book about the Pacific Northwest coast, and he's talking about reconciliation in 1967. So reconciliation is not new. We've been at it for a long time. There are Canadians who have been at it for a long time. Justice Haig Brown, Celia Haig Brown, the woman who did the first book about residential school. Her father was the law teacher of my great-uncle when he wasn't allowed to go to school. And it was with reconciliation in mind. And that was in the 20s. So, not new.
Well, I would say not new, for sure. And to name yourself as well, Lee, and the important writing that you've done, using the tools that are your gift to contribute to the reconciliation work of our country. You know, one of the things that we've been very clear on from the very beginning, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and ours in particular, had a time limit on it. It had a mandate. It was originally 5 years, and it's been extended a little bit, so we're into our 6th year now. But it was never understood to be more than really what was prescribed in our mandate to do, and we had a number of specific tasks that we had to do that we're almost finished now. It was, so let's say, a 6-year project. But right in our mandate, there's a fantastic definition of reconciliation in the context of our TRC, and that we didn't write that. It was written by the survivors and the members of the parties to the settlement agreement, so the government and the churches who were taken to court by the survivors. And what they said about reconciliation is this: not that it's a 5 or 6 year TRC, but that it is an ongoing individual and collective process. Ongoing, individual, and collective process. And then it says who's involved. It says it involves the survivors and their families, those who lived and worked at the churches, and lived and worked at the schools, rather, and ran them, and their descendants, the churches, the government, and the people of Canada. The people of Canada. So I imagine that includes most of us, right? Yeah. And so the question then, when you think about reconciliation, is what does reconciliation mean in its purpose? And then what is the suggested pathway for getting there? And what does it mean in its purpose? I love the title of your gathering here, Change Up. Our chair is very fond of saying, and has said from the beginning, reconciliation is about respect. And then he evolved that a bit more to say it's about respectful relationships. I agree with both of those things. But I also started saying, for me, what is the point of that? Why does that matter? because it will take us, I hope, to a place of peace. Peace in our hearts, peace in our families, peace in our homes, peace in our country. And therefore, how do we get there? So what does reconciliation mean? And for me, the key word is change. It is change. Because if nothing changes, nothing will change. And we know, because we have ample evidence, now more than a century of evidence, almost a century and a half of evidence to tell us that the way we've been doing things is not giving us the kind of result that we need, where we have anything but a glaring and growing gulf by every measurable standard between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of our country, where we can have Canada sitting at 6 to 8% by UN standards of well-being indexes, and we can have the Indigenous peoples of Canada sitting at 63. That is a huge gulf, and it is not a measure of the proclaimed status that Canada gives itself about being such a fair and equitable country. So the how to get there is what we have, I think boldly, but very genuinely tried to offer up in those 94 calls to action. It's in a way a recipe for change. It's not meant to be the only good ideas out there, but it is our effort to be a respectful replay and synthesis of all that we have heard from 7,000 people who spoke to us, from the research that we've commissioned, from all of the massive archives that we've begun to probe. There's much more that has not yet been read, that you and your children will plow through, I hope. We've tried to mirror that back in a good way that says, this is what we've heard, this is what we've learned, this is what we've seen, this is what we've studied, this is what we have contemplated, and this is our best effort at offering suggestions for how we need to move forward. That's what the 94 calls to action represent. The reason they're not called recommendations, which is what our mandate said we were supposed to produce, is because we decided that sounded far too optional, and we didn't want them to be optional. So instead, we used the terminology very intentionally of calls to action. And what we have said, and I'll just end this point on this last footnote, is that if you look at the calls to action, and as a very first thing that you might do in Change Up, make sure you've read them all. They're not really, really long. Read them. There's only 94. And ask yourself, where do I fit in there? If it is an ongoing individual and collective process, where do I as an individual fit in? And what collectives do I belong to, whether it is my faith community, whether it is my civic government, whether it is my sports club? What do I belong to that I could also influence or encourage to also sign up for one or several of those calls to action? And that's what I would say about the 94. And I have some specific things that I would say further, but that's enough for now.
And I'm going to open it up to questions in just a few minutes. So if you want to begin to get thinking about your questions, and again, if you're feeling shy, you can tweet them, and Lynn will read them out. But that was a great, thank you for that segue, Marie, because we're at this conference, and there are amazingly inspiring young people here who are already working for change and leaders in their community. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what inspired each of you to do the work that you do, and talk to these people here who are sort of starting their path and starting their path towards being leaders and change makers.
I guess you have to know my family. I don't think I got inspired to do this work. I was doing this work when I was about 4 with my mother, trying to save people from the flu epidemic. And I was holding a dropper and dropping water into people's mouths for hours on end. I'll tell you a story, though. It's a funny little story. I saw my 2 aunts. They're not much older than me, 8 and 10 years. My daddy was the oldest, and then there was a lot of dead folks in between. But anyway, they say, how's Roger? And he's a year older than me. And he looks most like my dad. And I said, oh, he's good. He's cycling across the country with his brother-in-law. Oh, what's the cause? And I look at them, I'm like, the other one says, yeah, this family doesn't do anything without a cause. And I say, I think hoping two old men can make it. Nothing like Terry Fox, just off they go. And they said, oh, we should make him up a cause. We have to have a cause. So we sat all afternoon making up causes. But it's true. It began with the Princess of Peace, Capilano's wife, and then Capilano, and then George LaHood, then Chief Dan George, Amy George, Miranda, all Shade Point is my relative too, all his relatives. Auntie Ellen White, we both share an aunt. All of these people were part of my life, and we were always active, even when it was against the law for us to be active. I grew up with it. I didn't choose it. I really wanted to be a movie maker like my grandpa. We still didn't get to do that, but he got to act at least.
Well, I'm actually, I live in Yellowknife, Northwest Territories. I live among the Dene and have for the past 40 years, and I looked out in the audience and saw one of my nieces over there. I'm so happy to see her through her well, it's sort of niece in a Dene way. Her eldest brother and my daughter are married, so that's how it works. But anyway, I haven't always lived there, is my point. I grew up in southwestern Ontario, in Petrolia, Sarnia area. Very small world, very small community, very big extended family, and a huge sense of interpersonal responsibility and care. And it all happened subliminally. I wasn't conscious of it. You just grew up knowing that you pitched in and you helped other people, and that service was the point of it. And I had a wonderful conversation tonight at supper, our supper mates, and one of the young women was, I hope I'm not scooping something she may wish to say later or tomorrow, but we were talking about, sort of three pivotal things, an important statement she had made about knowing your role and your responsibilities, and then service. And I was thinking about that here, thinking, and this has to do with your question, because the other thing that I've learned along the way from my own elders and from Indigenous elders who have come in my path is the other part of it is to learn our gifts. Because we all have certain roles, but we all have specific gifts. So I came into this job, I think in part through the good fortune of the gifts I've been given, and being old enough to have had some sense of what those are, and being able to name them, and to say, I think I could offer these things. I mean, I applied to be a commissioner, but I applied to be a commissioner because I had been a teacher. And when I was a teacher, I realized journalists are also teachers if they are good journalists. And so then I became a journalist. And because I was a journalist, I realized I'm a very gifted listener. And I realized that I didn't learn that from journalism, I learned that from my grandmother. And along the way, living many, many places, I just, my boundaries were totally blurred, and I grew up with blurred boundaries about race and ethnicity and religious background and faith. I don't know why my family was that way, but my family was that way, and my life experiences took me into very enriching circumstances on all those levels. And when the commission came along, to bring it very close to home, my husband went to residential school for many years, and I was married for 15 years before I had any idea what happened to him at residential school. And I realized that this cloud of secrecy was a foundational underpinning to the social dismay that is so common throughout the country. And I realized it as a journalist, working as a journalist in Indigenous communities for many years, how many times there was a story on the surface, but you knew there was a story and maybe a story beneath that and a story beneath that, that was the unspoken story that didn't add up. And so when it came along, I thought maybe the gifts of listening and being able to discern meaning and being able to share that with others and to teach, maybe those things all add up to something that is calling to me to do this work. And on a very personal level, I care what happens because of my husband, because of my children, because of my grandchildren who have inherited all that they've inherited, and because of so many that I know, including my own sister-in-law, whom we buried barely 3 weeks ago, who lived on the fringes of all of this. It's not a past thing. It's not an over thing. It's an in our midst thing. It's an everyday thing. It's on our streets in all of our cities. And it's there. We just have not seen it for what it is. We have not known it for what it is. And we have not seen our own role and responsibility in the face of that. Nor have we been called in a proper way, I think, to bring our gifts in response to that. And that's what we're all doing now.
I would really love to open it up now to questions. So if you have a question, anybody, please raise your hand. And then there are a couple people with mics who can come to you. So.
And again, if you want to tweet your question, we can get them that way at ChangeUp 2015.
And I should say, it's great if you keep the questions kind of short, and certainly if you have something to add. Lee put it very beautifully earlier, and she said, think about sharing the space and sharing the room. So if you could share in a way that allows many people to share, that would be great. So does anyone have a question to start? Okay, there's someone right here, and then there's someone at the back. So can you?
Hello.
Yes. Right here in the, sorry,
Hi, my name's Erin. I'm a journalist from Vancouver, although I'm here as a delegate today. And my question for you both is, what can journalism contribute to reconciliation, this ongoing process? I've been fairly dissatisfied with my own contribution in that way, and I just don't even know where to start. And I know there's a lot of media makers, storytellers among the delegates who would probably also benefit from hearing your ideas. Thanks.
I think what's been made clear here, I started as a journalist too, but it's a springboard. It's a solid foundation. And I think that you're looking at projects with people. You're looking at working with people. And the first thing that a journalist has to know how to do is introduce themselves to someone. That's what I found out. I was tremendously shy when I started off, but I had to tap people on the shoulder. Excuse me, what's your name? I saw you talking over there. Could you just stick your face in this mic and talk to me? And it's not different in striking up conversations with people around reconciliation projects. So it's really a springboard to me.
I would say, in picking up on Lee's point, who are your sources? And think about that. Who are the everyday sources we see in all the major stories, in all the major media across the country? How often do we ever hear or see an Indigenous face or voice except on or about an issue that is deemed to be an Indigenous issue? When have we ever seen an Indigenous person who is a brilliant economist, or a brilliant medical doctor, or a brilliant engineer, or a brilliant lawyer talk about any of those other spheres of public discourse? We narrowcast issues to being Indigenous issues, and everything else is a Canadian issue. And if there's anything that we all need to deeply ingrain in our own understanding, is that the residential school experience in this country is a Canadian issue. It is Canadian history. It was Canadian laws that created them. It was Canadian policies that kept them going. It was Canadian mainstream thinking that underpinned the philosophy that allowed them in the first place. It is a Canadian legacy. It is a Canadian mess we need to clean up. And it is a Canadian opportunity to be brilliant in facing our own failings and to be inspirational to the world in turning things around. But we can't do it by having the same group of strangers not talking to the same other group of strangers. So who's on your Rolodex, to use the very old jargon? And the other thing I would say is, who's a journalist? I mean, I don't know how many of you are tweeting away now or after or between or before or tomorrow, but the whole notion of what is a journalist and what is news and who gets it from where is on its ear. And therefore, we are all teachers. We are all leaders. We are not all journalists. I actually have strong views about the importance of that being a qualified and credible profession, but I also know it's very blurred around the edges, and it's very different from when I was on the front lines of practicing it. But I do think that we need to get way beyond our comfort zone, dive into the deep end, and assume in a certain way, I will guarantee you, that if you ask new people that you've never talked to before questions about things you've never talked to them about, they'll have amazing things to say about it. And the final thing I want to say is, your question is really important, because not only should today's journalists be thinking about what they can do better, but journalism as a profession has to acknowledge its own huge contribution to the ignorance that has defined our country. Not only did we not teach about it in our schools, not only did we not teach about it in our universities, but we also have not covered it in our newspapers and on our radio and television. And even though we've had some stellar coverage on all platforms of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, at magic moments along the way, we have not had anything close to the sustained coverage of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we all as Canadians experienced of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is why we all think we know more about that one than we do about our own, or we think they're the same. So that's a journalism provocation, and it belongs to journalists at a time when it's, I know, dangerous within any journalistic enterprise to stick your head up. It's time to stick your head up and to find those brilliant stories and tell them.
Hi, my name is Kevin from Vancouver. Firstly, Lee, thank you very much for sharing your family song. That took great courage and was a very beautiful moment for myself. I am descended from Japanese Canadians who were interned during World War II. My mother, her parents, and her great-grandparents, 3 generations, lived through it. The reparations that the Japanese received include cultural aid. I was wondering, what would, not only Lee, but also you, Marie, what would you want to see in order to preserve the history, promote culture, and to help the present with the cultural development? Thank you.
That's really difficult to answer. First of all, we never stopped singing and dancing. Just because they said we couldn't didn't mean we stopped. So I'm not culturally bereft. And I know you've probably read somewhere that our cultures are dying and all this sort of stuff, but I think it's because you don't know us very well. No one knew I knew anything about Stalo people till I hit 55. Then I was old enough to know. Do you understand? When my daughters hit 55, they'll be old enough to know. When my sons at 55, they'll be old enough to know. When my grandchildren hit 55, they'll be old enough to know. And you'll find out that we're one long goddamn ass continuum. That we never were culturally perishing. So, that I don't know how to answer. We sing and dance and we do cultural things. What is missing to me, though, is the language restoration. And that's a much more expensive project than cultural things. The other thing that's missing is the modern cultural engagements we can get together on. My daughter was invited to do a play at the first Truth and Reconciliation opening in Winnipeg. She did. She called it the Moving Gallery, and with a group of young kids, she developed this beautiful backbone for a play that could go into a community and collect stories of mutual reconciliation and hardship in coming to Canada. If you're an immigrant, you've had a hard time. I know this. If you're Irish, you had a hard time. If you're Welsh, you had a hard time. Ukrainian, you had a... Nobody in this country's had an easy time except the very, very 1% wealthy people. So, we have lots to talk about. You're Japanese, you've had a hard time. Tom King wrote one of the greatest stories he ever wrote was One Good Truck, that one. It's in our story, and it's the Japanese internment. And I was laughing all the way through until I realized, oh my God, that's what happened to us. We can do that with each other. Those are the kinds of things that will make us fall in love with each other. The cultural things that we can do together. I think that's more important, personally.
Well, I think it's extremely important, most particularly because the vast majority of 7,000 people who talked to us said it's extremely important. When people talk about what they lost, it's one of the top 3 things that they name. And language is huge. And it is huge not just because it's a nice thing to have. You know, these are languages that are unique in the world, and they're ancient. And sometimes, I mean, I one time did a report. It was a terrible report that began, the opening line was, Mrs. So-and-so spends all day talking to herself. She was the last living speaker in the world of her language. And there are many Indigenous languages in Canada that are on the cusp. There's sort of a 5-year critical window, according to linguistic experts, for turning some of these around. So what do I know? I know that Canada, and through the church agencies, spent a lot of money over many decades destroying languages. And I know that English and French were used as weapons against Indigenous languages. And I know that Indigenous children were used as weapons against their own languages. And I think we have a great reckoning to do as a country that goes into the world so proudly as being a bilingual country, to do cultural and linguistic restitution. And I think we should be generous and bold when we tell politicians how we want those budgets allocated, so that there's some fighting chance and not some little scrap of a bone for language retrieval that is not realistic. I also think Indigenous communities have to be really rigorous and honest about which ones stand a fighting chance, because they may not all, and it kills me to say that. But I think that there's a need to be strategic and assertive and aggressive in trying to hang on to those ones that can. And I think non-Indigenous Canadians, just as they would if they moved to France or Spain or anywhere else, should wake up and show some interest in learning the Indigenous languages of where they are. And I think that belongs to all of us. And I don't think it should be something that we plug our noses about, but rather embrace as an exciting thing that we could do that would place a huge marker on the world. And some of the languages, by the way, cross over into the United States, so there may be bold international initiatives that we could take that would make it more affordable and manageable, and would build critical mass of instructors and students and so on. And my last point on this, and kind of get me going, but you know, I know I was not born speaking French, but I learned French. I worked very hard to learn French. But I also had it in starting in high school, every year if I wanted to. I also know that as a result of speaking French, I've had advantage on certain job applications. I know that for those, not me, but those I'm jealous of, they actually got paid to go learn French instead of running up huge student debts, as I did. And then they get a premium for being able to speak French in the workplace. So, you know, why don't we do that for some Indigenous languages? You know, why do I live in Yellowknife, where there are 11 official languages, and I have a Radio-Canada that answers in French and English? for people who moved there from somewhere else? Why is that right and fair? What is the gap between what is legal and what is just in our country? And how do we start filling those gaps?
Yes, back there.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Wilson and Lee, and for hosting this. I'd also like to thank the InSpirit Foundation for creating this space for these opportunities to exist. It's incredibly important work. I believe I have the same line of thinking, Commissioner, around reconciliation being founded on respect. I also believe that reconciliation's fundamental principle is effective communication, of truly understanding one another. I've recently been inspired by the activist Bell Hooks, who, and I'm going to paraphrase this, is that the plight of the oppressed is that they must endure their oppression and then explain it to their oppressor, which to me resonates with regards to the TRC and the reports, being inspired in the impetus from the survivors themselves. So as a youth worker and a community worker, I'm struggling with having to use Eurocentric forms and systems to explain Indigenous ideologies and having to explain the systematic inequities that comes along with that. So I'm wondering if either or the both of you have any anecdotes, experience, or advice with regards to using these Eurocentric procedures to explain these highly Indigenous practices, and the struggle and successes and or balance or achievements you found living in both those worlds.
Might as well keep going this way.
Okay.
I don't want to be a pissant, but when you come to someone's house, don't name someone from someplace else. I know that we're invisible to you, but I was writing before Bell Hooks. She my friend and I love her. But, I'm just saying, let's start with looking at Aboriginal people, because the big thing is we're invisible in this country. When Egerton Ryerson decided we weren't fit for academia, it was 1867. 2 doctors graduated from University of Toronto, one Haudenosaunee, one Anishinaabe. They went to high school twice, once at residential school, and the second time at a European school, because they don't teach you anything at residential school. And that been maintained all the way through to the early 50s. My relatives came out of there not knowing how to read and write, and I didn't find that out till I went to publish. And some publisher said, "We can't publish your work because Indians can't read and write." I went and stood on the corner of Main and Hastings with 3 other women. We took a poll with everybody there. We hit 3,500, which was then a Canadian bestseller, and found out that 90% of my folks could not read and write on that street corner. So we got hold of Frontier College and every Native graduate from high school that we could, got a Trudeau grant, went all over the country and taught 3,500 people to read and write, got them to sign a petition saying they'd buy my book now that they could read and write. And that's how I got published. The survivors and their descendants are heroic. They're not just survivors. There was a little boy, 3 years old, and every time he fell and hurt himself, the bigger girls would pick him up and whisper another word of their language in his ear. And he came out of residential school one of the best language speakers in his nation. They fought for that. They hid for that. They dodged priests for that. They did everything good for that. And now he's teaching art, history and art in his school. He did university orally. Imagine doing your master's degrees orally. Because he had his culture intact, he had his language intact, and he was a goddamn smart Indian. We have a lot of heroes. So first of all, let's find our heroes in our neighborhood. I don't know where you're from, sister. You're from British Columbia? Well, so am I. See? There you go. Chief Dan George, the Princess of Peace, Capilano, Lee Maracle, Joanne Archibald. Come on, let's go. We're going.
I know all those people. I sit on the board for Full Circle, which is an Indigenous performing company, and all of those people inspire me. And I have a great anecdote from Gordon Tatusis, who was one of my last mentors before he passed away. And one of his struggles...
Cree, though, right?
Cree. More trees, more... What do they say? I'm not going to say that on here. But he was saying one of his struggles was that he would go onto movie sets and have to explain the process of smudging. He said one of the most horrendous experiences he ever had was explaining this incredibly sacred ceremony and having the technicians bring in fog machines, smoke machines, and lights. And he was constantly, and before his death, he expressed to me how excited and hopeful he was that we would no longer have to struggle in these incredibly colonial forms. That one day there would be a set of Indigenous filmmakers and storytellers and journalists who would capture it properly. And I think in preparation of coming here and in spirit, communicating the diversity of the people being here as a responsible, what I believe responsible participant is learning about not just about the people in my community, but as what Commissioner is saying is to wake up and see everyone else in this country.
So I think you named your project, it's around Gordy Tatusis, eh? And he was good looking.
I just want to make sure we can get to, do you want to?
I did want to respond. Yes. First of all, I want to acknowledge, I'm forgetting your first name, and that, what is it? Kim. Kim was the one who said the brilliant thing at my supper talk, by the way, so I just, since she's there, I want to give full credit. You know, I want to say a couple of things, Kim. Your question is a very important one. I hope this is helpful and not too oblique. One of the things that we had as commissioners, each of us, had a designated, not a designated, we chose them, spiritual advisor who walked with us throughout our work. And we called on these each in our own way. And most of the time we were not all together in that, though occasionally we did come together. And mine, one of the very first things he said to me, and I'm sharing this with you now, he said, Marie, this is going to take a great deal of humility. And he said, I don't mean humility as the opposite of ego. He said, I mean humility as the opposite of impatience. That things will change and they will take a long time to change, and you may not see the changes you wish. You certainly will not see most of them in the lifetime of the commission, and you may not see them in your own lifetime. But you need to believe that where good people are gathering and work is being done in good spirit, that things will shift and that other good people will come along and do their part, and that over time things will change. So partly I want to offer you that because I think partly answers your question, which is not to say get complacent and get cozy with the status quo. That's not what I'm saying at all. Keep agitating. But to do things, I think, in a gracious way and to assume good in the other people. Look at our room here. Look at the diversity of this room. When I grew up, when I was your age, I was never in a room that had this diversity. Never. We were opened up this evening with acknowledgement of traditional territory. 10 years ago, that was nothing close to being normalized, and now it's exceptional if you don't hear it. And it's a small thing, and it mustn't become mechanical. I think that's very important, but at least it's something. And I think form is huge as well. If you have a possibility in your room to influence the form. And by that I mean if a circle can be used, try for a circle. This building is a circle. This room, not so much, but the building itself is. That helps people see each other and really see each other. And in our work, we found that in many ways that's a helpful form to use. But the thing that I think is really I guess the hardest thing to your question is that I think Indigenous people are going to have to keep teaching. And I don't think that's a bad thing as long as non-Indigenous people start listening. Because there's a lot of catching up to be done. And if we begin by shaming people for what they don't know and have never been taught, we get people in our corners. I think if we find gracious ways to teach people what we have to offer and to listen to what we need to learn, then we can start to inch forward together. So, impatience, we can't, I often say to non-Indigenous populations, don't get tired of hearing about this. Do not tolerate, why don't they just get over it? Do not tolerate that. Don't get tired of listening to this. So many survivors have not yet been able to say a word about this. They're still so broken. And so we cannot get tired of listening. But at the same time, those who have things to teach, I think, I call on all of those people who have things to teach to not get tired of teaching it.
I'm getting the signal that we are slowly running out of time. I think there have been 2 people waiting by the mic, so we give the last 2 people that have been waiting the longest, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Should we possibly take the questions together to see if, so let's hear both the questions, see if we can weave them into 2 answers. Does that sound okay?
Let's try that.
All right.
What learnings, best practices, advice would you give to future Truth and Reconciliation Commissions? I'm thinking in other parts of the world that still need restitution, like Afghanistan or Syria, or future Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that haven't even been thought of yet. Given your experiences, what would you tell them today or tomorrow?
Okay. And then over there.
Hi, I am Youth, and I've been presenting to schools around Toronto trying to introduce the plight of First Nations and Aboriginal in Canada. And I was just wondering if you could give any guidance of the basic knowledge to teach youth in order to start creating a positive conversation for change. Because I am having some difficulty with that, with teaching non-Indigenous youth. So with your experiences, I was wondering if you could provide any guidance, especially with youth who do not have much knowledge about this area.
Okay, so do either one of you want to leap on one or both of those questions?
So we just get all the questions
okay,
then, and
sure.
we'll just wrap up? Yeah.
We take one more, is that okay? Do we have time, Peter, to throw one more into the mix? Okay.
I'll just give a quick one. I'm just curious now, the 94 calls of action that have been put forward, knowing that they're calls to Canada and Canadians in general, and that we personally have responsibility as citizens. What is the Commission doing, knowing that we have, the upcoming federal election, but is there work going forward of the Commission taking action, and what does that look like, and what is conversation with the leaders looking like in terms of, or with the Commission itself? Thank you.
And do you know what? There is a Twitter question. I'm just going to read it out.
Okay, read the Twitter question.
Where is it there? What does it feel? Why does it feel as if Indigenous people are doing all the heavy lifting on reconciliation? Huh? That's a good one. So that's a great range of questions, but over to the masters.
I just have a couple of responses. The first one is the gal who says we have a plight. That's like people saying, well, we saw you raped, so now we understand. Whether we have a plight or not, we need reconciliation. Do not think that I was ever tragic. I was never tragic. My family didn't have a plight. What they had was someone move into their house and toss them out. That's unfairness and domination. So that's one. The second thing is that reconciliation is up to you, really. Like the girl who loves Tutusis. If you want to do a project about Tutusis, I'll jump right on that. Because I love him too. And I love his niece who's still alive. And a singer. You got to think of something you want to do. You don't know anything about us. So think of anything. Who cooks here? There you go. Find a group of people who will cook with you and make a cookbook together, a Canadian Aboriginal cookbook, you find yourself reconciling. You'll find yourself reconciling because you have relations with us.
So I'll try to touch on a couple of things. So to the question of truth commissions, we were our commission and we were unique in some of the ways I've described, but I think there are a couple of things that we've done that were very particular, and we've been told by international Truth Commission colleagues that what we did was unique and extremely valuable. One of them is we made it part of our practice at our 7 national events and at a couple of events in between to organize major youth education days. We reached out to youth, and those days were not those days. They were a culmination of several weeks of classroom work by schools, Indigenous and non-Indigenous classrooms, working together to prepare and then coming together and meeting and hearing from firsthand survivors, and then making commitments to things they would take back to their schools after that. That's a very short version of it, but that was a really important thing, is to focus on the youth and educating the youth. The other thing that we did that I think was very important is we made a decision early on that wherever we were in the country, many people think Indigenous people in Canada is sort of one thing, you're either First Nations or you're Métis or you're Inuit, but within each of those nation groupings, there's enormous diversity, and particularly among the First Nations. So we made a conscious decision to respect the cultural practices and protocols and celebrations of wherever we were. And so we had, for example, colleagues from the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission tell us that they thought they'd missed an opportunity there, that they hadn't included any cultural celebration or cultural uplifting as part of their work. And not only was it important to showcase what are some of the strengths left to build upon, but also it was a tremendous lifting up of spirits after some very, very hard work. And so it served a really important, I almost want to say therapeutic, but sort of healing purpose as well. And it was very inclusive and was a way for everyone to be involved. So I think those are good things. The other thing that I want to signal, and by signaling it I'll identify, I'm very honored to see in the crowd Barbara Hall here, who was, of course, your longtime mayor, but also the chair of the Human Rights Commission for Ontario and of the National Association. And Barbara is also, most importantly of all, one of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission honorary witnesses. We reached out, and we now have approximately 75 prominent Canadians and international agencies or individuals who we approached and asked, and they agreed to stand as honorary witnesses. And what that meant was, because somebody made the point reconciliation's only happening, only Indigenous people are involved in reconciliation. And that would actually be a disservice to the many, many, many non-Indigenous people across this country who are engaged, some very actively, some for decades, have been involved in reconciliation efforts, and some very tentatively and just starting, but very passionately committed. And Barbara is one of those. And one of the things she did, and it's to one of the other questions about how do you go forward, she used her public space, the space she had available to her in her office at that time. She's doing other things now, but I'm just using that as an example. Because space is very important. And when you have space and can define what happens in that space, who's in that space with you, who will be in the room with you, and how will that time be used, that can make an enormous difference to the richness and the depth of the dialogue that can happen. And I'm just picking up on one example of one thing that I know Barbara did, but she's done many things and has kept this issue alive, and so have the other people, the former prime ministers and auditors general and governors general and judges and filmmakers and authors who are all involved, using their own spheres of influence. Because not everybody can talk to everybody about everything, but you can talk to the people in your realm of influence and say, here's some stuff that I know or that I've recently learned that you may not yet know about it, and I want to share that with you. To your last very important point, I think this is the last of the points. I can't touch on your question in the school, and I'm not trying to be dismissive of your question, perhaps Lee can, but I wanted to suggest, because it's a huge question, maybe it's one that you could workshop over the next day with your group. I wanted just to make that suggestion so that you could get some satisfaction and not feel like I'm brushing off your question. It's a really important question. But I do want to talk about the election. So yes, we have 94 calls to action. And as you may know, 2 out of 3 of the national parties have said that they endorse them all in principle. So here's what I think about that. We had residential schools for decades and over a century. Many parties were at the helm at the time. All national political parties apologized, including the Bloc Québécois, by the way. So they're all on the record of how sorry they are, and they're all on the record of how things are going to be different. They're not on the record on specifically what is it they're going to do. So our 94 calls to action, I think, are a good recipe book for them to say, okay, well then we'll do this. We'll follow these. And for you as voters, as citizens, as the boss of all those people, to use this electoral period to be very specific and determined with all your candidates to say, first of all, do you know about the TRC? Anybody who says, no, never heard of it, I would say, don't vote for them. If you ask them if they have read the 94 calls to action and they say no, I'd be pretty skeptical. But you know, you might say, I expect you to have read them, and then I'm going to have questions to ask you about it. That might be a way to go, so they actually will read them. And then here's what I would specifically draw your attention to, and I'm not advocating for any party. Reconciliation is a nonpartisan issue. And in fact, if we were functioning well, it would be an all-parties debate about an all-parties commitment in a healthy House of Commons. But if you look at our call to action number 53, as my friend used to say, number 53 on your scoreboard, number 1 in our hearts. No, no, it's not my favorite, but I think in this time frame it's the most strategic. It is the one that calls for the creation of a National Council for Reconciliation as an ongoing body, so that when the 3 commissioners step down, there's not a structural void. There's somebody whose job it is to keep paying attention to all this. And the National Council basically would do 2 things. I'm really simplifying. 1, it would pay attention to the other 93. Is anything happening on the other 93? And it would keep them alive. And secondly, it would be set up as an ongoing mechanism, kind of like an Auditor General's office, at arm's reach from governments, to say, we're here to measure and assess and report out on that great big fat gap that we talked about earlier tonight. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Are we counting the right things? Are we even measuring the right things? Are we making any connection at all between the growing numbers of murdered and missing Aboriginal women and the direct and intergenerational consequences of residential schools? Are we connecting those dots to see how that fits together? Are we paying attention to the number of Indigenous children in care, far more than ever were at the peak of the residential schools, who are in fact not knowing their culture and their language or anything, much as it may well be alive for some people? And so we need to pay attention, and this is the body that would say, we're going to pay attention to this. So I encourage you, if you haven't yet read the 94, go home so you can be smug enough to ask your candidates the same question, and then guide them in a good way to say, if not, we really want you to pay attention to this. I think they all, though, need to be expected to know what is their party's position on it and what's the first thing they're going to do. And are they prepared to implement that national council that will keep it alive?
Thank you.
Okay, but I'm going to ask you to do it this way. Don't call it number 53, please. Because the very moment you call it number 53, government's going to stop at number 53. Don't call it number 53. Say, we need a national commission to implement the recommendations.
I'm just trying to help them find it so they'll know which one to read.
And that recommendation is on page 47, 53.
I don't know what page it's on. They're numbered, 1 to 94. It's 53.
Oh, my goodness. I wish we had more time for more questions. Thank you all for bringing your questions, and I hope you'll continue to have these conversations throughout the next few days and throughout your lives and at home around your dinner tables. Rachel, thank you for guiding us through this conversation, and also a thank you to the interpreters. You know, I always love watching you, and I love that we can all engage in this conversation. I think for me, I'm taking away a couple of things that it's important to remember that sometimes I take for granted. Reconciliation is not about an event in the past, but it's about an issue today and for our future. It's not a problem for other people or about other people, but it's about an opportunity for all of us. And Marie and Lee, thank you for bringing that to us today and for inspiring us to be active, to call for all 94, 92. To fuel us in this journey of action, we'll have coffee. Will be served after this. There's also a session for the Bring Your Own Sessions. We'll be meeting at 9:30. There's a circle in the round over there. And most importantly, a pair of car keys have been found. They can be found at reception.
Most importantly, what?
I think that one of the things that we've really heard quite a few times tonight is the importance of space and the importance of creating spaces and bringing people inclusive spaces where we can have these conversations and be together in relationship. And so thank you again to Karim and to the Ismaili Center. Please join me in thanking you for having me tonight. Please stay and chat, have a cup of coffee, and stay engaged. Thank you.